Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I'm going to be doing another book review for another Brandon Sanderson book, and that is Oathbringer, the third book in the Stormlight Archive. This is a book I was super excited to read. I read The Way of Kings, I believe last December, and then I read Words of Radiance in March. So now in August, at the time of recording this, I think this video may be coming out later, but I read this book in August. So been working away at this series every, 6 months or so maybe, or a little less than that, I guess, between the first two books, but been working at this series. I've been working at Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere books in general. I've read most of them at this point. I still have a couple left to go. So I was super excited to read this one. I loved the first two books a whole lot. The first book, Way of Kings, was my favorite book that I read last year, and up until this point, with spoilers for my thoughts on this book, up till this point, Words of Radiance was my favorite book that I read this year. And so I was very excited, obviously, to read this one. And it's hard for me to really say how I thought of it compared to the other two books, which I'll talk about a bit more later probably, but this is a strong contender for being my new favorite Sanderson book. I really loved it a lot. So first we'll talk some positives and negatives, and then I'll talk about some spoilers later in the video because I have a lot of spoiler thoughts on this book as well as I did with Words of Radiance. So to talk positives, first of all, everything that has been done well in the other books is done well here. Character work in this book is excellent as usual. Each of the Stormlight Archive books focuses on a particular character. We even know which characters are going to be the main focus of even the future books. Brandon has come out and said what his plan is for that. But the first book, Way of Kings, focused primarily on Kaladin, and then it also had Shallan, Dalinar, and Adolin in there as well, but Kaladin was the real main focus. If you don't know, for some reason, if you're watching this and you don't know, these books also have flashback chapters that go into the backstory of the focus character. So it had Kaladin flashbacks, and it was primarily Kaladin's book. Although he was by no means the only important character, but he was kind of the focus character. Book 2, Words of Radiance, that was Shallan. You got a lot of Shallan, you got a lot of Shallan flashbacks. In this book, that focus character is Dalinar Kholin, who is I forget the exact wording, I believe he's a high prince or something of that sort. Very high up within his kingdom, very high rank. And this book is about him, a lot of this book is about him kind of, in the first couple books, he got this command, this message to unite the Knights Radiant and to bring them back and fight off this evil threat that is happening. And this book is him trying to achieve that. He's already kind of started working at that over the course of the first two books. Now he's trying to unite the whole, all the people of this land in order to fight this greater threat. And so this book goes heavily into that. It also goes a lot into his backstory, of course, with the flashback chapters. There's a lot of flashbacks with Dalinar. And one of the other positives for this book, kind of springing off of this, is I loved the flashback chapters with Dalinar. I enjoyed the flashbacks in the first two books a decent amount, don't get me wrong, but they were never my favorite part of those books. I wouldn't say it was my favorite part of this one either, but in the first two books, the flashbacks, I enjoyed them, but usually I was way more interested in the present day storyline. Whereas in this book, I was super into the flashbacks. These are my favorite flashback chapters so far in the series. I really enjoyed them a lot. Getting to see Dalinar's backstory, which was especially interesting because in past books, he has had parts of his memory that he can't quite remember, particularly pertaining to his wife. And he can't remember who she is or anything about their interactions. He can't even remember her name. And so he, there's this big mystery about his past. Why can't he remember this person? And why can't he just remember so many big things about his past and all of this stuff? And this book goes into some of that. He starts to have flashbacks to his past, and you learn about who he was and why that all happened, why he no longer has this memory. And there are some really, really big things pertaining to that are explained in this book, which was excellently done. It was heart-wrenching at times. It was just excellent. The chapter where you find out exactly why all of that stuff with his lost memory was going on was just like, it was one of my favorite chapters in the book. I'll just say, I'm not gonna get too much into that. For the sake of spoilers, of course. And I really loved the flashbacks for him in this book. I really loved his storyline in general. It was more political, him kind of trying to get all of these different leaders together and try to bring them together and make them work together against this greater threat of the Voidbringers. That was all super excellent. As far as other character stuff, all the other characters in this book were also excellent. You have lots of returning characters from the first two books. Of course, you have Kaladin and Shallan, the main characters of the first two books. You also have Dalinar's son Adolin, who in this book, one thing I really enjoyed also was that he and Shallan are starting to have a relationship. They are supposed to be getting married as kind of more of a political thing, and over the course of this book they start to actually get to know each other, and I really enjoyed that relationship a lot. And then also you have Shallan, who in book 2 started discovering her ability to basically, for lack of a better word, put on different faces to kind of become like different versions of herself. That gets expanded a lot in this book. That is super excellent in this book. She does a lot of awesome stuff in this book. I'd say probably next to Dalinar, Shallan was probably actually my second favorite character in this book. She was super great. Kaladin, of course, probably my favorite character in the series up to this point. Now that we've had a lot of good stuff with Dalinar and Shallan, it's hard for me to say if he's still my favorite, but Kaladin was great in this book as well, of course. And then plenty of other characters. Navani was good in this book. Adolin, as I said, was excellent here. Seth, who you didn't see very much of in the first two books. You get a little bit more of him in this one. He was really, really good in this book. I really enjoyed his arc throughout this book a lot. Venli, who you saw a little bit of in book 2, in some of the interludes and things like that, shows up a bit more in this book. She's really interesting. Let's see, who else? You get a lot of like Spren stuff, like with Syl, Kaladin, Spren, things like that. You have Dalinar communicating with the Stormfather, which has already been shown in the first two books a decent amount. That was really excellent. You've got Bridge 4. One thing I loved about this book in particular, that wasn't in the other two books. You got a decent amount of Bridge 4 in the first two books, but in this one you have entire chapters specifically dedicated to members of Bridge 4. So you have a chapter dedicated to being from the point of view of the Lopen, you have one from the point of view of Rock, you have one from the point of view of Teft, things like that. Even Moash, who due to the events of the last book is no longer directly a part of Bridge 4, you get several chapters from his point of view and what he's up to, and all that stuff, which I loved. I love getting that point of view chapters from those characters who I really enjoyed in the other books, but this book really made me grow more of an appreciation for them. I would say especially Teft, who at this point, solely because of this book, is now one of my favorite characters in the series. I really enjoyed his arc throughout this book. And just all the other characters in this book. There's so many other ones that I can't even go into because there's just lots of stuff going on with them. They were all super excellent, lots of interesting character interactions, interesting character arcs, all that stuff. To move on a little bit, talk about the plot. I already kind of explained a little bit of what it's about, but I think the plot in this book was really interesting. I think this book was a little different from the other two books where, you know, the other two books were very much plot focused, but I feel like this one was even a bit more so, maybe. The other two books, you know, had, you know, the interesting world building, the character development, kind of the build up into what this series was going to be. Lots of action, all that stuff. This book is much more political, much more about character interactions, much more about uncovering the world's mysteries, figuring out the answers to some of the questions that were posed in the first two books. So I would say this one's maybe a little more plot focused in some ways, which I think was really interesting, and it made it feel a bit unique from the other two books, which I really enjoyed. And the plot itself does some really interesting things. A lot of the story for this book takes place in Uruthiru, or I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the tower city thing, whatever it is that they found in Words of Radiance. A lot of this book takes place there, and also brings the characters to some interesting other places that I'm not going to spoil, but it's very interesting how the plot unfolds in this book. As far as some other stuff, I loved seeing some of the resolutions to some of the questions that have been asked in the first two books. There were some interesting twists and turns along the way that I really enjoyed. Last few things here, I also want to say that the ending of this book was completely crazy. I had heard from a handful of different people that Sanderson has a reputation for having what his fans call the Sanderlanche, which is essentially a heightened version of a climax where just everything happens all at once, a bunch of revelations, bunch of exciting action, good character moments, all that stuff just thrown right at you at the end of the book. This book has an absolutely insane ending. Just non-stop action and exciting stuff going on for a good 150 pages or so, and it was so good. I really enjoyed it a lot. Lots of great character moments thrown in there. And then kind of the last 50 or so pages kind of winds things down a bit. So that was really excellent. The ending of this book was just absolutely crazy. I had to stop about halfway through because I just wasn't able to keep reading. I was like, oh, I wish I could keep going, but I'm gonna have to finish this up tomorrow. And so that's what I ended up having to do, and I was really bummed out about that because I just wanted to keep going. And one more thing that I do want to mention really quickly, I really enjoyed some of the wider Cosmere connections in this book. I would say out of the 3 Stormlight Archive books so far, this one probably has the most wider Cosmere connections that I noticed, at least, particularly to Warbreaker. So if you're a big fan of Warbreaker like I am, you'll probably enjoy some of the stuff in here. So I really enjoyed seeing a lot of those connections, and as I've been reading more Sanderson, now that I'm caught up on most of his Cosmere work, I've been kind of able to pick up on more of those things, which has been a lot of fun, and I caught on to a few things in this book, which was really interesting. And as far as negatives, I usually talk about negatives in these reviews. I don't really have any. So yeah, basically everything I have to say about this book is really positive. I really enjoyed it a lot. It was just absolutely fantastic, beginning to end. Was a bit slower than the first 2 books, but like I said, I was super into the politics, super into the character stuff. So even though it was much kind of slower paced, kind of more taking its time, not quite hopping across to as many different locations and things like that, it was still really excellent, and I enjoyed it quite a lot. So no really negatives to speak of. So that means now I get to talk spoilers. So if you have not read this book before and you would like to, which I would highly recommend doing, by the way, go to later in this video. I'll have timestamps down in the description of where you can go to the end of this video, where I'll give my rating of the book and talk about everything, you know, more generally, all that stuff. But I'm going to talk spoilers now. So you have been warned. If you have not read this book before, don't watch this part of the video. So to get started on spoilers, so first I'm going to talk about the Dalinar flashbacks, I think. So Evie, Dalinar's wife, you find out that he inadvertently killed her by setting fire to this town or whatever it was, which was just heartbreaking. I had an idea that something Dalinar did caused Evie to die, considering some of the epigraphs at the beginning of the chapters during a certain part of this book. I can't remember if it was part 1 or part 2 or whatever, but they were taken from the book Oathbringer, which towards the end of the book you find out Dalinar actually wrote. And considering the connection he has to that name, that was the name of his shard blade that he had. I figured that was coming directly from him, and it talks about how he did something horrible and all this stuff. So I had a feeling that he did something really terrible that caused his wife to die, but the way that was handled was just excellent and heartbreaking, and I really enjoyed seeing Dalinar and his backstory in this book, seeing how much of a, you know, people always referred to him as the Blackthorn and everything, and how he was this kind of very militaristic, very, you know, action focused, you know, always thirsting for battle and all these things. And you really get a good sense of that in the flashbacks, and then seeing how that resolves was also excellent. Some other stuff I really enjoyed. I think the next one I'm going to talk about is Teft, because something that they kind of have in common, both Dalinar and Teft, is they deal with a lot of their stuff with alcohol. At least it seems like alcohol, from what I can tell, which is not something that I've experienced myself, but I loved seeing that stuff, seeing just how broken down both of them were, and seeing them trying to deal with all of that, and especially Teft towards the end of the book, as I said, during that kind of big Sanderland section, where each of the Knights Radiant has to swear their oaths. And the one that Teft says, where he says, you know, I will protect even those I hate, even when the person I hate most is myself. That just hit me really hard. Really, there are several different oaths that are spoken in this book that really did that for me as well. Some other stuff, trying to think here. One thing that I liked, kind of going more into the ending of the book as well, the last, like, maybe, I would say, like, I'm trying to think here where it was, but like the 1100 to 1200 page mark-ish, like, nearly brought me to tears multiple times with some of the stuff going on. The thing with Teft that I mentioned, Dalinar confronting Odium, which is a huge thing that I didn't even talk about earlier because, you know, spoilers. But Dalinar confronting Odium, the big bad of this series, it seems, multiple times in this book, was excellent. I was not expecting to see that happen at all. And seeing how Odium had been kind of pushing Dalinar along this path for so long, saying like, I am the one responsible for you doing all these horrible things and all that stuff, was just such an excellent kind of a twist. It was kind of a twist, I guess. Seeing that, you know, the reason why Dalinar did all these things was because he was influenced by this evil force and all that stuff. And then also kind of bouncing off of that with the thrill being an actual, I can't recall if it was said to have been like a spren-like being or whatever, but being an actual thing that Dalinar then interacted with in order to kind of get rid of was super cool. I didn't expect it to be like an actual evil force, that, you know, Odium, being this kind of villainous character, was kind of bringing out. I expected it was just, you know, this typical thing, like, you know, you're a warrior, you're super into that, and you just get the thrill of battle or whatever. And I didn't expect it to be an actual literal force of evil, basically, which was super interesting. And then you also had Taravangian, who basically betrays Dalinar, which is something that I kind of saw coming. I think it was well foreshadowed throughout the book, and I believe I also had seen people discussing it a little bit online. That's one of those things that I didn't quite have entirely spoiled for me, but I kind of got that sense. You know, that was really good. Taravangian was a very interesting character in this book. Seeing him interact with Dalinar was also very interesting. And then you also have the crew going into Shadesmar, which was super interesting, getting this very different alternate version of the world, basically, with Azure, who is a very interesting character, who I'm not going to go too much into this, but based on discussions I've had with a couple of friends, as well as some of the things that I've been able to tie together myself in my own brain, seems to be a character we've seen before, which was very interesting. And then, you know, all that stuff. She was a very interesting character, getting to know her, seeing her kind of do her thing. Hoid in this book, of course, as Wit. I loved Hoid in this book. He was, I'm just going to refer to him as Hoid rather than Wit, because that's how I think of him in my head, as Hoid. He was excellent in this book. This book, the chapter where he talks to Shallan, and kind of has a really good discussion with her, that's maybe my favorite Hoid chapter in any of the Stormlight books so far. I really enjoyed it a lot. Seeing him appear is always a lot of fun, of course. One other thing about him that I really enjoyed as well, in the epilogue, it appears that he used Awakening from Warbreaker on the doll, which was super cool that I caught that, and I was like, oh, nice little Warbreaker thing in there, because of course I love Warbreaker. Trying to think if there's anything. I'm sure there's so much more that I can talk about with this book, but this video, I've already been recording for over 20 minutes, so I feel like I should probably wrap things up, but I'm sure there's plenty more that I could talk about with this book. But if you have any particular spoiler things that you would like to point out in the comments, feel free to do so. But I loved this book so much, and there's so many things I could talk about with it, and I'm sure there are plenty more that I could talk about right now, but I either can't think of them, or I feel like I've already taken up plenty of time talking about all the things I've already discussed. So, spoilers are going to be over now. I'm no longer discussing spoilers. We're going to talk about my overall thoughts on this book, which are, of course, super positive. I loved my time with this book. This actually took me quite a while to read. A lot of books recently that I've been reading have not taken me very long. Granted, this is a huge book. It's like 1,300 pages. It took me about 2.5 weeks, which is a bit long for me. But I felt like because I had to kind of take it a little slower because I just haven't had as many chances to get through this as I would have liked, I felt like that kind of helped me kind of to get really into it and spend more time, you know, thinking about it and all that stuff, which I think also helped my enjoyment of it a bit. But I really loved this book a lot. It is probably, or maybe not probably, but it's definitely a contender for my new favorite Sanderson book, which I didn't really expect going in. I didn't think anything could take over Way of Kings for me, because at that prior to this, Way of Kings was probably my favorite Sanderson. But I think this definitely gives Way of Kings a run for its money. And if I were to point out in terms of it being a favorite, like, you know, which book has more negatives for me, Way of Kings does have a couple of little things that I was not as much into, like the interludes I didn't care for as much, which, by the way, something I completely forgot to mention, interludes in this book were excellent. Didn't care for them much in the first 2 books, but I really did like them here. Just wanted to mention that before I forgot. So if you count that, I think this is probably a better book than Way of Kings. So this is maybe my new favorite Sanderson book. So of course, for a rating for this book, I would give it a 10 out of 10, which seems to be a consistent theme for Stormlight. I'm pretty sure the lowest score that I have given one of these books is like a 9.5. I forget what I exactly gave Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, but I'm pretty sure I gave both of them either a 9.5 or a 10. This series has been really consistently incredible for me so far, just like all the other Sanderson that I have read, but Stormlight especially just really hits for me in a really good way. So let me know down in the comments if you have read Oathbringer and what you thought of it. And if you have any thoughts on any of the spoilery things that I maybe forgot to talk about because there was just so much to talk about that I couldn't possibly remember to think of all of it, then let me know that and down in the comments, and we can maybe have a discussion about that. I'm very excited to continue this series. I'm going to be reading Dawn Shard and Rhythm of War later this year. I got my hands on Rhythm of War quite recently. I've had Dawn Shard for a little bit, so I'm going to be reading those hopefully by the end of the year, which I am very, very excited for. So excited to continue this series and to continue the Cosmere now that I'm almost caught up. So that is pretty much it for this video, so thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.